Welcome back to those who are part of this broadcast online. I've got with me Ross McGregor, who's had a long and influential theatre career, directing theatre and television, and as artistic director for a number of prominent theatre companies. And as a teacher, he eventually turned to theatre. Since 1969, he's directed widely there as well as on screen, and he has adapted and shaped the dramatic reading that we're hearing today of Picnic at Hanging Rock. Ross, wonderful to have you as part of the conversation.
Thank you.
With him, someone else who's worked with this material extensively. Matthew Lutton's been artistic director of the Malthouse Theatre for the last 2 years, previously working with them as an associate artist and acting artistic director, which makes him the youngest director of an Australian major performing arts group. And in this capacity, he directed an acclaimed stage adaptation of Picnic at Hanging Rock in 2016-2017, which toured here and also went to Edinburgh, and it's returning to the UK shortly. Ross, let me start with you. This is not a long book, but it's full of complex layers. What's your starting point in creating something that makes sense for performance rather than the page?
Cutting out a lot of the big print. By that is the description pieces, like, talking about the bush, that kind of stuff. So you need to have the story clear, and you need to have the characters clear, and you need to have descriptions of the characters so we know who they are, what they're like, and then you need to I cut a half of the novel, so there's a lot in there of we get to know the Australian bush a lot more than we do here. I just put in as much as I possibly can, and those are the major changes.
Matthew, you face the same challenge. I wondered how helpful or not the film is when the film has such a powerful hold over the imaginations of many Australians.
It's true. I think when we were conceiving the theatre work, we knew that the imagery from the film would be something the audience would be bringing in with them, and that's actually a provocation to make a stage production that doesn't evoke the same sort of semiotics. Otherwise, you start sort of you may as well put the film on stage. So we had the biggest question, really, or one of the questions, was how to place landscape in the audience's imagination. And I think in the film you use a very realist mode and you can capture beautiful cinematography. And I think landscape, when portrayed in a realist way in theatre, is very disappointing. It never captures the sort of presence of and the eeriness or the beauty. So we turn to Lindsay's language. So we use, in the production that we created, all the landscape was evoked through language. So it becomes an act of poetics and recitation, and hopefully building that imagery in the audience's mind.
It's a tricky question, though, isn't it? Because nature and sense of place is an enormously powerful part of the novel. The origins of the novel are so strongly anchored in place, and yet that's something that you've got to create by other means. As you say, you can't, in some kind of hackneyed way, sort of dump it on the stage.
No, I think you've got to create something that's constantly evolving. I just think one of the great things about reading the novel is the way Lindsay is constantly developing the character of landscape. Like in those first few chapters that we were hearing being read, the descriptions of the exodus of snakes and the sound of the landscape and the sense of it being described as sort of the colours of the monolith. Like, she's constantly keeping that character alive, and I think that's something you have to do theatrically as well.
And Ross, back to you on that. You've identified nature as a sort of a vital force in the narrative. It is a power all of its own. How did you work with that?
Well, I just went and picked out from the book what I thought were the best things to leave in for the text, really, and going, well, we need that, particularly in the first 3 chapters, because you're getting into the book then, and I thought it was really important that the rock and how that was imaged and written about in the book, those images are totally necessary for anybody here to, by the end of it, you can start dropping things out. So it's a bit like anything, you've got to give a lot of information at the beginning about the characters, everything to set it all up, then later you can gradually drop it off because the audience has already got it in their heads.
And in fact, Lindsay's language gives us a lot of visual cues, certainly about the characters, but it's almost more important in some ways to retain those visual cues about that looming totemic nature of the rock, because you can sketch in the Irish groom or the irritable schoolgirl.
Yes.
Those are stock figures, but it's the rock's nature that's
Yeah.
enormously important to convey.
And also the I suppose one of the totally necessary thing is that the people that you've got, the actors, can convey that when they're reading. I mean, you're reading, you're looking down, and they need to be in the picture in the moment, imagining what that is and getting it out to an audience. I mean, we've tried to avoid any just straight read as a piece of news. You know, it's, yeah.
Just on that, Matthew, and one of the things that's quite central, and we heard this towards the end of the piece that we've just had performed for us, is that sort of suppressed hysteria of the girls, the sort of the febrile intensity of the environment. Now, these are challenging things for actors because, in a sense, they're very much about young adolescent femininity of more than a century ago now. They're ways of being that are quite difficult to inhabit for modern performers. Talk to me about that.
It is, but it's also something that's part of the storytelling of the show and of the piece. And I think when we were exploring our production of it, the way that we were sort of navigating that was in many ways we were presenting contemporary storytellers. We had 5 contemporary schoolgirls on stage, and so there was a constant sense of what is that relationship to clothing and body today, and how does that compare to 1900? And what theatre I think can do wonderfully is actually show both simultaneously, which is much more difficult on film, for example. So I think we were constantly looking at how we can be using Lindsay's idea of time, looking back at the different modes of sort of sexuality and the modes of sort of colonialism and bonding and all those ideas. And also looking at a way that I think, that sense of hysteria or that sense of panic or that sense of extremity, you explore by withholding. And one of the great things I think theatrically about this story is about how to hold things back and when to just open the floodgates with moments of terror or moments of sort of extremism.
And I'll just get you to explain to me that idea of a sort of a slippage of time, the technique you used for your stage adaptation. It's a fascinating approach to this, but how did that play out on stage?
It played out that we started with 5 actors in constant engagement with the audience, so they're very present. But as they started to return back to the rock, we started to slip back through the narratives back to 1900. So there's a very simple costuming convention that once Irma returned, suddenly Irma returned in a costume from the period and became trapped in that. It was about actually figures that once they entered into that rock, became trapped in that time, but started to turn into a myth and couldn't escape it. When one of the actors started to play Michael, she shifted from going from contemporary clothing to period. So there's a constant sense of once you enter into the rock and the myth, it's very difficult to remove yourself from it.
Yeah, which is fabulously consonant with Lindsay's own themes.
Yes.
Yeah, which works absolutely beautifully. Ross, what do you think the key qualities are that an adapted version of Picnic needs to retain? What's absolutely essential?
Keeping an audience interested in listening. It's a listening thing of how, because after a while, when we're reading a book, we can stop when we like, have a cup of tea, rest. But in a reading like this, you have got to keep the interest of the audience so that they can hear register all the words that are there. And to do that, I find that the most fascinating part of the book for me is that Joan Lindsay is absolutely stunning at setting up something and paying it off. So you can set something up really early and that you've got a hammer and then back. It's like the story of Sarah. And I find that the connection between Albert and Sarah is stunning because all the story in there, she calls out at the very beginning, "Bertie, Bertie, where are you?" And then he talks about his sister and how his sister has been taken off by some rich guy. So you start to connect what he talks about her and she talks about, and you just go, hello. and she never makes it clear that they're brother and sister. But they are when you delve into it, but she doesn't labour. I think that's great.
Ross, I thought that was a really interesting thing for you to touch on, that there are these subtle references seeded throughout the book, and in the text itself, there are moments that you hardly notice.
That's right.
They pass in the twinkling of an eye, and then much later you think, hang on, where was that?
Yes.
Let me go back to page 15 or wherever that
Yes.
passing reference was made.
Yeah.
Now, the work that you're doing here is by necessity quite reliant on dialogue and often on
Yes.
dialogue between
Yes.
people. So
Yes.
how do you interject that subtle seeding of references into the work?
You just follow the book. Really, I mean, it's written. It's sort of like one doesn't come up with something more clever. So, you know, if there is something, you just have to decide what you leave out, but you keep in. I kept in all, this first edit, I kept in all the dialogue and all the descriptions of the characters, and I cut the text, making sure that went in. And there's a few bits of dialogue, but there's an amazing amount of the actual dialogue from the book in this version at all.
Matthew, back to you. One of the things that's sort of enchanting about the book in its way is that there are so many loose threads. Of course, we don't know what happens to the girls, but there are also many other things that are simply left hanging.
Yes.
And they're not necessarily knit together in the text of the book either. They happen almost in parallel at the same time and in the same odd space and time.
Yes.
Is that a technical difficulty for you in bringing the work to stage?
It's more a pleasure, I think. I think like there's something wonderful in being able to. Well, as I think we know, one of the enduring things about the story is its lack of answers, and I think that's what makes it so thrilling and makes you returning to it. So I think on stage, you have to sort of set up multiple times on stage, and I think stages are very good at doing that. In, like you're saying, the relationship between Sarah or Sarah and Albert, and how you can actually place those two actors on stage simultaneously. The moment Ross was talking about, you can actually show different times simultaneously, different characters playing out, but never connecting with each other. And so there's something beautiful about the multi-dimensions of Lindsay's work being put on stage.
And I think if you were to take a sort of a strictly linear approach to this, you've really got about 3 different stories occurring with sort of loose connections between them at any one time, all playing out in this same space.
Absolutely. Like, she's writing quite a modernist piece of writing, and I think she has an obsession with time, and that's played out in multiple narratives, you know, multiple dimensions, characters that are right near each other, kilometres, you know, close to each other, but and sense each other, but don't acknowledge each other. So I think she does it in the book, and I think it's a great thing to explore on the stage.
Ross, I just wanted to go finally to you on this question of innocence, which is so important. That sense of innocence and knowledge being one of the key themes on which the book turns. The idea that somehow The Rock is about power and knowledge. The girls are also, of course, on the cusp of transition into adulthood, and we're in this period when so little is known about sexuality. Things are only intuited and hinted at. I wondered how you communicate that quality to actors and what it says about the choice of actors that you use to convey that.
I debate the innocence of the book.
Well, in one sense, it's a very knowing book, isn't it?
You know, because you've got, I mean, the sexuality part of it that she brings in. I mean, it's very interesting, the relationship between Albert and Michael, because you go,
isn't it just?
you know, so there's that, and I'm not. And so today, if you were writing it, you would probably make it more obvious or something.
But I think if I can just interrupt you there, I mean, certainly listening to the text as we've heard it read this afternoon, I was so conscious of that sort of constant light threading of homoeroticism. For the girls, for Albert and Michael, there's this sort of just constant drifting cloud of connections, quite passionate connections between people of the same gender.
Because I don't ever believe in words like innocence or any of that, because nobody can play it. So the actor can't, I'm an innocent person.
No.
They can't do that. So I don't use that. It's in the dialogue. It's in the description. So each of the actors needs to know that they can't be a blundering. If you're Miranda, you can't be blundering. I think that all of them have got I don't know if there are very many where is the innocence in the book? Did you find it innocent?
No, I wouldn't use the word innocent. I think there's denial, I think, or, or
Yeah.
repression.
Repression.
Yes,
Yeah.
repression.
But I wouldn't say and ignorance and naivety, but I would say innocence.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, perhaps it's the presumption of innocence, and the
right.
reality is one
Well,
of
I think
repression.
it's like it's legal. You're presumed innocent until you're found guilty
But of what, Ross? Guilty of what?
of what you are being accused, I guess.
Fascinating matters to conjure with, and wonderful to talk to both of you who've had quite different experiences of taking this mysterious, multi-layered, shifting piece of work and converting it into something that can take
I think
place
it's a
in a
great
live context.
book for anybody out there. I hadn't read it before, and I became more and more fascinated the more and more I got into it. It's unbelievable.
Ross McGregor, thank you so much for your time. Matthew Lutton, many thanks for your time. Thank you.